The Hells Angels biker followed the little girl to a collapsed fishing shack, where a hidden drawer exposed a silent crime. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's begin. The wind howled through the desolate stretch of road as Jake Reaper Morrison sped down the empty highway. The unmistakable sound of his Harley-Davidson reverberated in the cold night air, its engine growling like a beast eager for the open road. Jake had been riding for hours, his mind lost in the hum of the bike, when something caught his attention. A faint light flickered in the distance, barely visible against the dark landscape. His instincts kicked in, telling him that something wasn't right. He slowed his bike, squinting into the gloom. As he approached, he saw a small figure standing alone on the side of the road. It was a little girl, no more than 7 or 8, her clothes torn and stained with dirt. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes wide with fear. Without thinking, Jake brought the bike to a stop beside her. "Hey kid, you okay?" he called out, his voice rough from years of riding and smoking. The girl flinched at the sound of his voice, taking a small step back. "Please don't hurt me," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake felt his stomach tighten. He had seen his fair share of danger, but there was something about this moment that felt different. The girl was alone in the middle of nowhere, clearly scared and injured. "I'm not going to hurt you," Jake said, dismounting his bike and kneeling down to her level. "What happened? Where are your parents?" The girl shook her head, her eyes welling up with more tears. They left me," she stammered. "I don't know where they went." Jake's heart sank. He knew what it was like to be abandoned, but he couldn't stand the thought of a kid being left all alone like this. He reached out a hand, trying to offer some comfort. "It's okay," he said gently. "I'm going to help you. Come on, let's get you out of here." The girl hesitated for a moment, eyeing him warily. But then, as if something told her to trust him, she stepped forward and took his hand. Jake helped her onto the back of his bike, wrapping his leather jacket around her to keep her warm. He could feel her tiny body trembling against him as they rode through the night. After what felt like an eternity, they arrived at a dilapidated fishing shack by the water's edge. The place looked abandoned, the wooden structure sagging under years of neglect. The girl pointed to the shack, her voice barely audible. "This is where I've been hiding," she said. Jake could see the fear in her eyes as she looked at the shack, as though it held some terrible secret. "Are you sure it's safe here?" he asked, his voice low. The girl nodded, though her expression was filled with doubt. "I think so," she whispered. Jake wasn't so sure. Something about the whole situation felt off. But he wasn't about to leave the kid alone in the dark. He helped her off the bike and followed her inside the shack. The air was damp and smelled of decay. Old fishing nets and broken furniture were scattered around the room, and the only light came from a small lantern sitting on a rickety table. The girl led him to the far corner of the room, where a small wooden cabinet stood. "I found something," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. She pulled open the drawer, revealing an old, weathered box. Jake's eyes narrowed. There was something about the way the box was hidden that made him uneasy. He had been around enough shady situations to know when something wasn't right. The girl opened the box, and inside, she found a bundle of papers wrapped in a faded piece of cloth. Jake's heart skipped a beat as he realized what they were. Documents, old and worn, but clearly important. As the girl handed him the papers, a chill ran down his spine. He could feel the weight of what he was holding, as though it was something that had been buried for years, waiting to be uncovered. What was hidden in this box? And why had this little girl, of all people, found it? Jake knew one thing for sure. This was no ordinary discovery, and it was about to lead them both down a dark, dangerous path. Jake stood there in the dim light of the abandoned fishing shack, holding the worn bundle of papers the little girl had handed him. The atmosphere felt thick, like something heavy had settled in the room. His eyes scanned the room once more, trying to shake off the unease creeping up his spine. He could hear the wind howling outside, rattling the old structure, but inside it was eerily silent, save for the faint rustling of the papers in his hands. The girl stood beside him, her small figure barely visible in the shadows. Her eyes were wide, reflecting a mix of fear and excitement. Jake looked down at her, his mind racing. "You know what's in these, kid?" he asked softly, his voice low and careful. She shook her head, her dark hair falling across her face. "No," she whispered, "but I think it's important. I found them when I was hiding. I think it's connected to my mom." Jake felt a pang of sympathy for her. He could see the pain in her eyes, the kind of hurt that came from losing someone you loved. He wondered just how much this little girl had been through. Without saying another word, he opened the bundle of papers. The first page was a faded letter, its ink smudged but still legible. Jake's eyes narrowed as he read the words. "The location of the missing funds is secured. The key is in the drawer. Keep it hidden at all costs. They will come for it." The words were simple, but the weight of them hung in the air like a cloud of tension. Jake glanced at the girl, who was watching him intently. "Do you know what this means?" he asked, his voice now tinged with suspicion. She shook her head, her expression one of confusion. "No, I don't understand it. I thought maybe it had something to do with what happened to my mom." Jake's stomach tightened. He had a gut feeling that they had just uncovered something much bigger than a simple missing persons case. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the bundle, then turned to the girl. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice firm now. "It's not safe." She nodded, her face pale with worry. He could see the fear in her eyes, but there was something else too, something that made him think she knew more than she was letting on. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he knew he had to protect her. Whatever this was, it was far from over. The wind outside had picked up, and the sound of it whipping through the cracks in the shack made the whole place feel like it might collapse at any moment. Jake quickly made his way to the door, scanning the surroundings as he stepped outside. The night air was cold, biting, but the chill in his bones wasn't just from the temperature. He felt like they were being watched, and every instinct told him that they weren't alone. He helped the girl onto the back of his bike, wrapping her in his leather jacket to keep her warm. She clung to him tightly as they sped off into the night, the engine of the Harley roaring to life beneath them. As they rode, Jake's mind raced. Who was after the documents? And what did this have to do with the girl's mother? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that he didn't have the answers, but he needed to find them, fast. The girl was a mystery, and the situation was growing more dangerous by the minute. He didn't want to put her in any more danger, but something told him that helping her was his only choice. They rode for miles, the lights of the town just a distant glow on the horizon. Jake knew the area well, but tonight, the familiar roads felt foreign, as though the world had shifted beneath him. When they finally reached the outskirts of town, Jake slowed the bike, pulling off the main road and stopping in a secluded area near the woods. He killed the engine and turned to the girl. "We need to figure out our next move," he said, trying to sound reassuring. She nodded but said nothing, her eyes still wide with fear. As Jake glanced around, he saw a figure moving in the shadows. A man. Jake's hand went instinctively to the gun tucked into his waistband, but the figure didn't move any closer. He couldn't make out any details, but he knew that whoever it was had been following them for a while. "Stay close," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. He reached for the bundle of papers, his mind running through the possibilities. Whoever was after them wasn't going to stop until they had what they wanted. And Jake wasn't about to let that happen. The girl had already been through enough. As he prepared to move, he heard footsteps in the distance, heavy and deliberate. Jake's instincts screamed at him that they were not alone, and that danger was closing in. He didn't have time to waste. Whatever lay ahead, he had to be ready to face it. With the girl at his side, Jake knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. Jake and the little girl stayed hidden in the secluded area for what felt like hours, the silence between them heavy with the tension of the situation. The footsteps in the distance grew louder, and Jake's senses were on high alert. He had no doubt that whoever was following them was getting closer. He looked over at the girl, who was now huddled against the bike, her face pale, her small hands gripping the seat. Her fear was palpable, and Jake's heart tightened with the need to protect her. "Stay close, don't make a sound," he whispered, his voice low and steady, though his mind was racing. The shadows around them seemed to stretch unnaturally long, and every rustle in the trees felt like a threat. He scanned the surroundings again, trying to make sense of the situation. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was no coincidence, that someone had been watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Suddenly, the figure emerged from the trees. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket and a cap that obscured most of his face. Jake's hand instinctively moved toward the gun tucked in his waistband, but he didn't draw it. He had no idea if this man was a friend or foe, and drawing attention to himself could lead to more trouble. The man stopped a few feet away, his eyes locked on Jake. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension. Finally, the man spoke, his voice gruff but calm. "I know what you found," he said, his eyes shifting to the bundle of papers Jake was still holding. Jake didn't answer, but his grip on the papers tightened. This man knew too much. He had been following them. "You don't understand the trouble you're in," the man continued, stepping closer. "I'm not here to hurt you, but I'm here to make sure that you don't make things worse for yourself." Jake's eyes narrowed, sizing up the man. He didn't trust him, but he knew he needed information. "What do you want?" Jake's voice was a low growl, the words coming out more as a warning than a question. The man glanced over his shoulder, checking if anyone else was coming. "It's not just you they're after," he said quietly. "You've got something they want, and they'll do whatever it takes to get it back. You've got to get rid of it." Jake's instincts kicked in. This wasn't just some random encounter. Whoever this was, he was connected to whatever was happening. But the more the man spoke, the more Jake realized that he didn't have the whole picture. "Who are you?" Jake demanded, his patience running thin. "And why should I believe anything you're saying?" The man hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting around nervously. "I used to work for the people who are after you, but I'm done. I've seen enough to know that they don't care who gets hurt." Jake still didn't trust him, but the man's words rang true. He was no stranger to betrayal, and it sounded like this guy had walked away from something dangerous. "What do you know about the papers?" Jake asked, his voice cold. "What's really going on here?" The man sighed, rubbing his face with his hand. "Those papers, they're not just old documents. They're linked to a series of illegal deals. Dangerous people. People who have a lot of power." He paused, glancing at the girl who was still sitting behind Jake, her eyes wide with fear. "If they find out you've got them, they won't hesitate to come after you, and they'll use her to get to you." Jake's heart sank. He could see the fear in the girl's eyes, and it made his blood run cold. He wasn't about to let anything happen to her. Not after everything she had been through. "What's your angle?" Jake asked, suspicion creeping into his voice. The man took a deep breath before answering. "I don't have an angle," he said, his voice quieter now. "I'm just trying to keep you both alive." Jake didn't know if he could believe him, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had to take a leap of faith. He turned to the girl, his gaze softening. "We need to move. Now." He could hear the rumble of a vehicle in the distance, and it sounded like more people were closing in. The man stepped aside, giving Jake enough space to get the bike started again. "I'll help you," he said, his voice firm. "But you need to be smart. You can't just run. You need to find out who's really behind this, or they'll keep coming for you." Jake didn't hesitate. He kicked the bike into gear, revving the engine. "Get on. We've got a long ride ahead." The girl climbed onto the bike behind him, and they sped off into the night, leaving the mysterious man behind. But as they rode through the darkness, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. They were in deeper than he had thought, and no matter how far they ran, the danger was already on their tail. Jake's mind raced as he gripped the handlebars of his Harley, the engine roaring beneath him as they sped through the night. The wind whipped through his hair, but it did little to calm the gnawing feeling in his gut. The girl, clutching his jacket behind him, was silent, her small body pressed tightly against his back. She hadn't spoken a word since they'd left the secluded area, and Jake could feel the fear radiating off her. It wasn't just the situation they were in. It was something deeper, something she wasn't telling him. The last few miles had passed in a blur, but Jake's eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror. The sound of another engine echoed faintly in the distance. They were being followed. He tried to push the thought away, but it clung to him, a nagging whisper in the back of his mind. Whoever had been chasing them before hadn't given up, and now, it seemed like they were getting closer. "Hold on tight," Jake muttered to the girl, his voice low but firm. She didn't respond, but he could feel her grip tighten around him. The headlights of the vehicle behind them grew brighter. Jake's heart began to race. He knew he couldn't outrun whoever was tailing them, not without taking unnecessary risks. They needed to find somewhere to lay low, somewhere they could regroup and figure out their next move. The road stretched ahead, winding through the dense trees, and in the distance, Jake spotted a small cabin nestled at the edge of the woods. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He turned off the main road and slowed the bike as they approached the cabin. The light from the headlights of the pursuing vehicle flickered briefly before disappearing around the bend. Jake's breath caught in his throat, but he didn't waste any time. He steered the bike into the narrow driveway of the cabin, cutting the engine as he came to a stop. The girl climbed off the bike with a small, unsteady step, and Jake quickly led her to the front door of the cabin. It creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a dark interior. The air inside smelled musty, like it hadn't been lived in for years. The windows were covered with old curtains, and the furniture was sparse, just a worn couch and a couple of chairs. Jake turned on the flashlight from his phone, casting a dim light around the room. He quickly locked the door behind them and turned to face the girl. She was staring at him, her eyes wide and filled with fear. "Stay here," he told her, his voice calm but firm. "I'll check outside to make sure we're safe." She nodded silently, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Jake stepped back out the door and onto the porch, scanning the area around the cabin. The night was still, too still, and Jake's instincts told him something was off. He strained his ears, listening for any sound, any movement. A few moments passed before he heard it. A faint noise, like footsteps crunching in the gravel. He turned to the side, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. There, emerging from the shadows, was a figure. Jake's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the silhouette. It was the man from earlier, the one who had warned him about the people chasing them. Jake's finger hovered over the trigger of his gun, but the man raised his hands in a peaceful gesture. "It's me," he called out, his voice steady but low. "I'm not here to hurt you." Jake didn't lower his weapon, but kept it trained on the man. "You're the one who's been following us." Jake's voice was harsh, distrust heavy in his words. "I told you to stay away." The man took a cautious step forward, lowering his hands. "I know, but they're coming for you," he said urgently. "You don't have much time." Jake's grip on his gun tightened, but he didn't move. "Who are they?" Jake asked, his voice a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. The man hesitated, looking over his shoulder into the dark woods. "They're the ones who wanted the papers. The ones who don't care who gets in their way. And you just happened to leave them?" Jake asked, his voice bitter with disbelief. The man nodded. "I was part of it once. But I walked away. I can't be part of this anymore. I'm trying to help you, whether you want it or not." Jake didn't say anything for a moment, the weight of the situation hanging heavy in the air. He needed answers, but he wasn't about to trust this man completely. "Why should I believe you?" Jake asked, his voice steady but low. "Because you don't have a choice," the man replied, his gaze never leaving Jake's. "You and the girl are in danger. You can't keep running forever. You need to figure out who's really pulling the strings before it's too late." Jake stood there, his mind racing. He didn't want to drag the girl any deeper into this mess. But the man was right. Whoever was after them wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted, and the papers were just the beginning. Jake nodded once, his decision made. "All right, we'll do this your way. But if you're lying to me, I'm not." The man interrupted, his tone serious. "But you need to trust me. I'll help you get to the bottom of this." Jake glanced back at the cabin, then at the dark woods beyond. He had no idea where this would lead, but one thing was certain. This wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Jake stood at the edge of the porch, his mind running through the possibilities. The man from earlier had left without a word, disappearing back into the shadows of the night. The weight of the situation was starting to settle in. He glanced back inside the cabin at the girl, who was sitting on the couch, her eyes wide and filled with a quiet fear. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, and the danger wasn't far behind them. The man had warned him. He couldn't keep running forever. But Jake knew that if they were going to figure out what was really going on, they needed more information. He took a deep breath and turned back to the woods. His instincts were on high alert, and he wasn't about to take any chances. Whatever was waiting for them out there, he wasn't about to face it without being prepared. As he moved away from the cabin, he glanced over his shoulder one more time. The girl hadn't moved. She hadn't spoken. It felt like she was carrying a secret of her own, something that she wasn't ready to share. But Jake didn't have time to press her for answers. Right now, his focus was on figuring out who was after them and why. The cold night air nipped at his skin as he walked toward the edge of the property. The trees around him loomed tall and silent, their branches twisting in the wind. The forest felt like a living, breathing thing, its shadows stretching far and wide. Jake reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the bundle of papers the girl had given him. He unfolded them again, carefully examining the pages. His fingers brushed over the words, but they didn't make sense. Pieces of the puzzle were missing, and every time he thought he was getting closer to the truth, another layer seemed to appear, deeper and more complicated than the last. The letter he had found earlier still echoed in his mind, the one about the missing funds. Who were they? And why did the girl's mother have this information? Was she involved in something dangerous? The sound of footsteps broke through his thoughts, and Jake's hand instinctively went to the gun at his side. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. But it wasn't a figure in the distance. It was the girl. She stood at the edge of the porch, her eyes searching the darkness. "Jake?" she called out softly, her voice carrying through the air. "Are they coming for us?" He took a deep breath and turned to face her, putting the papers back in his pocket. "Not yet," he replied, trying to sound calm, even though he knew the danger was closing in. The girl stepped closer, her small form casting a long shadow in the dim light of the cabin. She looked up at him, her face a mix of fear and uncertainty. "I don't want to be alone anymore," she whispered. Jake's heart softened. He knew what it was like to be alone, to carry the weight of a past that haunted you. But he couldn't let her bear that burden. He stepped forward and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone," he said, his voice firm but comforting. "We'll figure this out together." She nodded, but there was something in her eyes that still bothered him. She wasn't just afraid of what was coming. There was something deeper, something she wasn't telling him. Before Jake could ask, the distant sound of tires on gravel reached his ears. His senses flared. Someone was coming. Jake quickly stepped back, pulling the girl into the shadows of the cabin. "Stay quiet," he whispered, his voice low. She nodded, her breath quickening as she clung to him. The vehicle grew louder, and within seconds, the headlights of a truck pierced through the trees. Jake's hand tightened around the gun in his waistband, but he didn't move. He watched as the truck came into view, the engine roaring as it slowed to a stop in front of the cabin. The figure behind the wheel was obscured by the headlights, but Jake could make out the silhouette of a tall man stepping out. Jake's instincts told him this was trouble. He couldn't stay hidden forever, but now wasn't the time to confront whoever was out there. He waited, heart pounding in his chest, as the man walked around the truck. The door to the cabin creaked open, and a voice called out, "Hello? Anybody home?" It was the man from earlier, the one who had warned him about the danger. Jake's grip on his gun loosened slightly, but his body remained tense, ready to act at any moment. "We've got to go," Jake whispered to the girl, his voice urgent. The girl nodded, her face pale with fear. Together, they slipped quietly out the back of the cabin, moving through the trees as quietly as possible. Jake kept an eye on the man's movements, watching as he approached the cabin's porch, his flashlight sweeping across the dark yard. They had to get away. There was no time to waste. They couldn't stay in one place for long, not with the danger closing in. The sound of the truck's engine faded as they moved deeper into the woods, but Jake's thoughts were still racing. Who was this man really? Why had he come to warn them? Jake had no answers, but he knew one thing for sure. They had to find the truth, and they had to find it fast. Jake and the girl moved deeper into the woods, the cold air biting at their skin as they kept low, barely making a sound. Every step felt like it could be their last, and Jake's senses were on high alert. His hand hovered near his gun, his eyes scanning the dark forest around them. The last thing he wanted was to be caught out in the open, with nowhere to run. They had to find a way to stay one step ahead of whoever was after them. The man from earlier, the one who had warned them, was still somewhere out there, and Jake knew that he couldn't trust him completely. But for now, he had no choice but to rely on what little help he could get. The girl was still silent, her small form tucked tightly against Jake's back. She seemed to be holding something back, something she wasn't ready to tell him, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story than she was letting on. The further they walked, the more the shadows of the trees seemed to close in on them. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and every rustle in the brush made Jake tense. He could feel the girl's breath quicken as they moved, her fear palpable. "We're almost there," Jake whispered, his voice low. He didn't know if they were safe yet, but he couldn't afford to stop. They needed to find shelter, a place to regroup, and maybe, just maybe, find a way to figure out what was really going on. The forest opened up ahead, revealing a small clearing with an old cabin in the distance. It looked abandoned, just like the last one, but it was their only option. Jake quickened his pace, the girl following closely behind. They reached the cabin in a matter of minutes, but Jake didn't hesitate. He quickly moved to the door and checked it, making sure it was locked. The last thing they needed was someone else finding them. He pushed the door open slowly, careful not to make too much noise. The inside of the cabin was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the dirty windows. Jake stepped inside first, scanning the room for any signs of danger. The girl followed, her eyes wide, taking in every detail of the cabin. It was a simple place, just a few chairs, a table, and a small wood stove in the corner. It seemed like it had been abandoned for years, but there was something oddly comforting about the emptiness. Jake motioned for the girl to sit down in one of the chairs while he closed the door behind them. He locked it and turned to her. "We need to stay quiet for now," he said, his voice firm. The girl nodded, her gaze shifting nervously toward the window. Jake could tell that she was scared, but there was something more beneath the surface. He needed answers, and he needed them now. "What's really going on here?" Jake asked, his voice low. The girl didn't respond immediately, her fingers twitching nervously at her side. "I don't know," she whispered finally, her voice trembling. "But I think it's connected to my mom." Jake felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had suspected as much, but hearing it from her made it all the more real. "What happened to your mom?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with a sadness that was almost too much to bear. "She disappeared," she said softly. "I don't remember much, but I know she was involved in something. She always told me to stay away from certain people, but I didn't understand." Jake sat down across from her, his mind racing. Who was she involved with? The girl swallowed hard, her lips trembling. "I don't know," she whispered again. "But I think it has something to do with the papers. The ones I found." Jake nodded slowly. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but he still had more questions than answers. "Where did you find them?" he asked. The girl hesitated before speaking. "Behind the wall in the old house," she said, her voice barely audible. "I didn't know what it was at first, but when I opened it, I saw the papers. And then I heard someone coming. I had to hide." Jake's eyes narrowed. The girl was clearly more involved in this than she realized. But he needed to get to the bottom of it, and the only way to do that was to find out who she had seen. "Who was coming?" he asked. The girl shook her head, her hands trembling in her lap. "I don't know," she whispered. "But they were looking for something. And I think they were looking for me." Jake's mind raced as he processed her words. Whoever was after them wasn't just after the papers. They were after the girl, too. And that meant they were in even deeper than he had thought. The danger was real, and it was closing in fast. He stood up abruptly, his hand reaching for his gun. "We need to move," he said, his voice sharp. "Now." The girl stood up quickly, her face pale with fear. Jake could hear the sound of tires on gravel in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. He looked out the window, his heart racing as he saw the headlights of a truck pulling into the clearing. "They're here," Jake muttered under his breath. "Get ready." The girl grabbed his arm, her grip tight. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake didn't have time to answer. The truck's headlights grew brighter, and Jake knew that they didn't have much time. They had to get out of there, and fast. He grabbed the girl's hand and pulled her toward the back of the cabin. There was a narrow trail that led into the woods, and Jake knew they could use it to escape. But they had to move quickly. The sound of the truck's engine was now deafening, and Jake's pulse quickened. This was it. They were out of time. Jake pulled the girl toward the back of the cabin, his breath shallow as he scanned the dark woods. The truck's engine was close now, the low rumble of the tires on gravel cutting through the night. He could hear the voices of men, low, tense, searching. He didn't have much time. The girl stumbled behind him, her small feet struggling to keep pace as Jake's mind raced. They had to move fast. "Come on," he urged, his voice a harsh whisper. "Stay close." The girl clung to his side, her face pale in the moonlight. Jake couldn't help but notice how she looked smaller than before, the weight of everything pressing down on her fragile shoulders. They reached the edge of the clearing, where the narrow trail to the woods began. Jake took a quick glance over his shoulder. The truck's headlights were cutting through the trees, inching closer to the cabin. They had no choice. They had to take the trail. Jake gripped the girl's hand tighter and pulled her toward the trees, the thick underbrush rustling beneath their feet as they pushed forward. His heart pounded in his chest. The night air was thick with tension, the scent of pine and damp earth filling his lungs. As they moved deeper into the woods, Jake's senses went into overdrive. The sound of the truck's engine was still there, growing louder as it drew closer. He knew they were being hunted, but he also knew that they had a head start. If they could make it to the old logging road just a few miles ahead, they might be able to lose them. The girl's footsteps were light, but they were slowing down. Jake glanced back at her. She was breathing heavily, her face flushed with fear and exhaustion. "We can't stop," he said, his voice firm but low. "Just a little further." The girl nodded, but her face was filled with a quiet panic. She wasn't used to this. She wasn't used to running for her life. Jake's mind raced, thinking of the man who had warned them earlier. What had he meant by, "They won't stop until they get what they want"? Who were these people? And what was so important about the papers that they would chase them through the woods in the dead of night? The sound of the truck's tires on gravel was getting louder, the engine's roar now unmistakable in the thick silence of the woods. Jake's heart raced. They were close now. He glanced down at the girl, who was gripping his hand tightly, her face pale and drawn. She was scared. He could see it in her eyes. He wasn't about to let anything happen to her, not if he could help it. But they needed a plan, a way to get out of this mess. They kept moving, their pace quickening as they pushed through the thick underbrush. The moonlight barely cut through the trees, and the woods seemed to swallow them whole. Jake could feel the girl's breath on his neck as she struggled to keep up, her small feet slipping on the uneven ground. Every snap of a twig, every rustling leaf, sent his heart into overdrive. The truck was getting closer. He could hear it now, the sound of the engine roaring, the tires crunching against the gravel. They had to move faster. They couldn't stop. The trail ahead was getting steeper, the ground more treacherous. Jake's eyes darted around, searching for a way out, a way to lose their pursuers. He needed a place to hide, something to block their path. And then, just as he was about to make a decision, he saw it. Up ahead, the trail split into two. One path veered left, leading toward a dense thicket of trees. The other curved right, winding up the side of a steep hill. Jake's mind made a quick decision. The hill would be harder to climb, but it would give them a higher vantage point. He pulled the girl with him as they veered toward the right, pushing themselves up the incline. The sound of the truck grew louder. They had no time to waste. The girl's breath was labored, but she didn't complain. She kept moving, just a step behind Jake, her small body trembling with fear. Jake's legs burned as they climbed, his boots slipping on the loose gravel. The steep hill seemed endless, but he pushed on, his heart pounding with each step. The truck was close now. Too close. Just as they reached the top of the hill, Jake heard the truck's engine cut off. His heart stopped. They weren't alone anymore. He knew they'd been spotted. He could hear the men yelling, their voices echoing through the woods as they split up, searching for a trail. The girl froze beside him, her body stiff with fear. Jake's mind raced. He couldn't stay here. They needed to move, but he couldn't risk being seen. He grabbed the girl's hand again, pulling her toward the edge of the hill, where the trees grew thicker. They could hide there. They just needed to be quiet. "Stay low," Jake whispered urgently. The girl nodded, her face pale but determined. Jake crouched low, keeping one eye on the trail below. He could see the men now, moving quickly, their flashlights scanning the area. He could feel the tension building in the air. The hunt was on, and this time, they weren't going to stop until they had the girl and the papers. He didn't know how long they could keep running, but he knew one thing for sure. They couldn't let them catch up. Jake held his breath as the footsteps of the men below echoed through the trees, growing louder with each passing second. He could hear them splitting up, the sharp crackle of branches beneath their boots as they searched for any sign of movement. The truck had stopped at the bottom of the hill, and Jake knew they wouldn't be far behind. His mind raced with plans and contingencies, but nothing seemed foolproof. If they didn't get out of there soon, they'd be trapped. He looked at the girl beside him, her small form crouched low beside the tree, trembling with fear. Her wide eyes reflected the same terror Jake felt, but she didn't say a word. She was too scared, too lost in the nightmare that was unfolding around them. Jake's eyes darted around the forest, scanning for a way out. The dense woods stretched out before them, but the darkness felt suffocating, closing in on them from all sides. The men would be searching in no time. They couldn't stay hidden for long. The girl's breathing grew shallow, and Jake gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Listen to me," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustling of the leaves. "Stay calm. We're going to get through this, but we need to move." The girl nodded silently, her lip trembling as she pressed herself against the tree. Jake took a slow, deep breath, his instincts urging him to make a move. He had to get them out of this situation. He glanced back down the hill toward the truck, seeing the flashlights moving closer. He could make out the faint silhouettes of the men, their figures flickering in and out of view as they moved through the trees. Tom was running out. He took the girl's hand and tugged her along the edge of the hill, keeping low and moving quickly. The ground beneath them was uneven, littered with rocks and fallen branches, but they pushed forward, every step calculated. They needed to get to the clearing ahead. Jake could see the faint outline of the logging road just 100 yards away. Once they reached it, they'd have a better chance of making their escape. But the noise from the men was growing louder, and Jake's heart raced as he realized just how close they were. "We have to keep moving," he urged the girl in a low voice, quickening his pace. She stumbled slightly, but Jake steadied her, his grip firm on her small hand. The sounds of the search party grew louder still. A voice shouted in the distance, "They've got to be close. Check the hill." Jake's heart skipped a beat. They were being hunted. He didn't know how much longer they could keep up the charade, but he knew one thing. He wasn't about to let them catch her. They reached the clearing, and Jake pushed through the last stretch of underbrush, emerging onto the open logging road. The moonlight was faint, but it was enough for Jake to see the trail ahead. "We're almost there," he whispered, his voice tinged with desperation. The truck's headlights were now visible through the trees, coming closer. Jake's heart raced as he led the girl forward, their feet kicking up dust and gravel as they moved. But just as they were almost to the road, Jake heard a sound that made his blood run cold. A voice from behind them, clear as day. "I see them." Jake spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. The man who had warned them earlier appeared at the edge of the clearing, moving fast, his expression grim. "Run!" he shouted, and without another word, Jake grabbed the girl's hand and bolted down the logging road. The man behind them fired a shot into the air, his voice calling out again. "Get to the cabin. Go." Jake didn't question the order. He didn't have time. The sound of the men chasing them grew louder, the pounding footsteps of their pursuers ringing in his ears. He could feel the girl's grip tightening, her small form barely keeping up with his fast pace. The road ahead was long, winding into the woods, but it felt like they were getting nowhere. They had to find shelter, and fast. Jake glanced over his shoulder, seeing the flashlights of the search party flickering in the distance, but they hadn't reached the road yet. He had a few moments to think. They couldn't outrun them forever. They needed to find a place to hide. And then, through the trees, Jake saw it. Another cabin, old and abandoned, hidden in the forest. It wasn't far, but it would give them a place to regroup. "This way," he shouted to the girl, his heart pounding as he veered off the road and cut toward the cabin. The girl followed, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. They reached the cabin just as Jake heard the sounds of footsteps closing in again. He pushed open the door, scanning the area before ushering the girl inside. He slammed the door shut behind them and quickly locked it, his pulse racing. They were safe, for now. But Jake knew this wasn't over. The men would keep coming, and soon, they would be right outside. He turned to the girl, his face hardening. "We need to stay quiet and keep moving," he said. She nodded, her face pale and scared, but Jake could see the resolve in her eyes. They both knew this was far from over. They had to survive the night, and figure out who was behind all of this before it was too late. Jake kept his back pressed against the rotting wooden wall of the cabin, his senses alert to every sound in the darkness. The girl sat on the floor beside him, her small form trembling but her eyes wide with curiosity and fear. The silence between them was thick, the kind that only comes when you're waiting for something inevitable. The truck's engine had faded into the distance, but Jake knew they weren't safe yet. They had a small window of time, and he wasn't about to waste it. "We need to keep moving," Jake muttered, more to himself than to the girl. His mind was racing. How long before the others found them? What if they couldn't escape? The thought of them getting trapped here made his blood run cold. But where? The girl whispered, her voice cracking. She had been through enough. Jake didn't want to burden her with more, but they had to get out. His eyes darted to the small, broken window above the sink. Through the cracks, he could make out faint shapes moving in the distance. It wasn't the truck. These were people, and they were moving fast. Jake didn't need to think twice. He grabbed the girl's hand and pulled her up from the floor, ignoring the stiff pain in his own legs. "We're leaving now," he said, his voice hard. The girl nodded, following his lead. They moved through the cabin's narrow, dimly lit rooms, avoiding the debris scattered across the floor. Jake's mind was fixed on the door, but the floor creaked beneath their feet. Every small noise felt like it would give them away. When they reached the back door, Jake carefully pulled it open, scanning the outside for any sign of movement. The cold night air hit them like a slap to the face, but Jake didn't hesitate. They stepped into the overgrown yard, the moonlight barely illuminating the thick woods around them. Jake's hand tightened around the girl's, leading her toward the tree. They couldn't stay on this path. They had to find a way deeper into the woods. He kept glancing behind him, half expecting to see the men from the truck catching up. But the forest around them seemed eerily still, and the sounds of pursuit had faded. Still, he wasn't taking chances. As they moved, Jake's mind drifted back to the conversation with the man earlier. He didn't trust him, but what he had said was starting to make sense. Whoever was after them wasn't just after the papers. They were after the girl, too. And whatever this was, it was far from over. "Are we safe?" the girl asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her breath came in quick, short gasps. Jake looked down at her, his face softening for just a moment. "For now. Yeah," he said, though he knew better. They couldn't afford to stop. They needed answers, but more than that, they needed to escape the nightmare they had walked into. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across their path. The dense woods seemed endless, the trails unclear. But Jake had spent enough time in places like this to know that staying on the move was their best chance. If they stopped, they were done. A crackling noise broke the silence ahead, followed by a faint voice calling out, "Over here." They went this way. Jake's stomach dropped. They had found them, and they were closing in. He grabbed the girl's arm and pulled her into a narrow ravine, where the underbrush was thick enough to hide their tracks. He crouched low, listening. The sound of footsteps grew louder, but then faded as the men moved further down the trail. "Stay quiet," Jake whispered, his breath shallow. The girl's face was pale, her small hands clutching the edge of his jacket. She was shaking now, more from fear than cold. They stayed hidden in the ravine for what felt like an eternity, the only sounds the rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant calls of their pursuers. Jake's mind raced, running through his options. He could try to confront them, but the odds weren't in his favor. His gun would only do so much. The girl was too important. He couldn't afford to risk her safety. Then, just as he thought they were safe, he heard a voice much closer than before. "We know you're here. Come out now, and no one gets hurt." Jake's blood ran cold. He knew the game was up. The voice was different now, more authoritative, more threatening. They had found them. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he realized that they had no more time to waste. He reached for the girl's hand, his pulse quickening. "We need to move," he whispered urgently. They had to act fast, before it was too late. He pulled her out of the ravine, leading her toward a narrow path he remembered from earlier. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to buy them a few extra minutes. As they moved, the sound of footsteps grew louder. Jake looked ahead and saw a small creek cutting through the woods. It wasn't much, but he knew that if they could get across, they might be able to throw their pursuers off the trail. "We're almost there," Jake said, his voice tight with urgency. The girl nodded silently, but her grip on his hand tightened as the sound of the men drew nearer. The creek was close now, the water running swiftly under the moonlight. Jake didn't hesitate. "Jump," he said, as he grabbed the girl's waist and lifted her across the stream. The moment she landed, they both took off running. They had to make it across the creek and into the thickest part of the forest, where they could disappear for good. But as Jake looked back over his shoulder, he saw something that made his heart stop. The men were still coming, and they weren't alone. Jake and the girl moved swiftly through the woods, their feet pounding the damp ground beneath them. The creek was now behind them, but the sounds of the men pursuing them were only getting louder. Jake's heart raced in his chest, the adrenaline pushing him forward. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a branch, made his pulse quicken. The men were close, too close, and the girl's small hand was gripped tightly in his own. Her breathing was fast and shallow, matching his own, and he could feel her fear radiating through her. Jake's thoughts were scattered. They needed a plan, a way to shake off their pursuers, but he wasn't sure how long they could keep running. The night was still and heavy, and the dense trees around them seemed to close in with every step. The sound of the men's voices grew louder, more urgent. They were shouting now, calling out to each other as they split up, searching for Jake and the girl. He knew they couldn't keep this up for much longer. "Stay close," Jake muttered, urging the girl forward as they sprinted through the underbrush. She nodded, her grip on his hand tightening, and they kept moving, ducking under branches and leaping over fallen logs. Every step felt like a race against time. They couldn't afford to slow down. But then, as they pushed deeper into the woods, Jake's eyes caught something in the distance. A small cabin, its silhouette barely visible against the trees. It wasn't much, but it might provide the shelter they needed. Jake didn't hesitate. He yanked the girl toward it, his heart pounding in his chest. The cabin was run down, its windows shattered, but it looked abandoned. It would have to do. "In there," Jake said urgently, pulling her toward the door. They reached the cabin in seconds, and Jake pushed the door open. The hinges creaked in protest, but it didn't matter. They were in. The inside was dark, the air musty and stale, but it offered the briefest moment of respite. Jake quickly shut the door behind them, locking it as best as he could. The silence inside the cabin was deafening. The sounds of the forest faded, replaced by their own heavy breathing. Jake turned to the girl, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to stay quiet," he whispered, his voice low. "We're safe for now, but we can't let them hear us." The girl nodded, her small body trembling. Jake could see the fear in her eyes, but there was something else there too. She was hiding something. He wasn't sure what, but the way she kept looking at him, like she wanted to say something but couldn't, made him uneasy. He didn't have time to push her for answers now. They had to focus on getting out of this mess. Jake moved to the window and peered through the broken glass, his eyes scanning the forest outside. The men were still out there, and if they had tracked them this far, it wouldn't be long before they found the cabin. They had to come up with a new plan, and fast. "Do you know what they want?" Jake asked quietly, turning back to the girl. She shook her head, her eyes filled with confusion. "I don't know. I don't understand any of this. They were after my mom, and now they're after me." Jake's stomach twisted. He had feared as much. Whoever these people were, they weren't just after the papers. The girl was the key to all of this. And he didn't have any answers for her. "Not yet. We can't stay here," Jake said, his voice hardening. "We need to keep moving." He started pacing the room, his mind working through every possible escape route. The men would be searching the woods, and once they realized the cabin was empty, they would track the girl's trail. They needed to make sure they weren't seen. Jake's eyes landed on a small trapdoor in the corner of the room, hidden beneath a faded rug. He walked over to it and pulled it open, revealing a narrow staircase that led down into the darkness. "This way," Jake said, turning back to the girl. She hesitated for a moment, her face filled with uncertainty, but then she nodded. Together, they descended into the darkness, the only sound their footsteps echoing against the wooden steps. The air down here was cooler, but it felt safer. Jake could hear the faint sound of the wind howling outside, but it was muffled by the thick walls of the underground space. He turned to the girl as they reached the bottom. "We'll wait here for a while," he said. "Once they give up searching, we'll move again." The girl nodded, but Jake could tell she wasn't convinced. She wasn't just scared of being caught. She was scared of something else. Something deeper. "What is it?" Jake asked, his voice soft. The girl bit her lip, her eyes filling with unshed tears. "I think I remember something," she whispered. "Something about my mom. Something I didn't understand before." Jake's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The piece of the puzzle he'd been waiting for. "What do you remember?" he asked urgently. The girl hesitated, her eyes searching his face. I think my mom was hiding something, and now they're coming after me for it." Jake's pulse quickened. He didn't know what it was, but he knew they were on the verge of uncovering something much bigger than they could have ever imagined. And whatever it was going to change everything. Jake sat on the cold wooden floor beneath the cabin, his thoughts spinning as he watched the girl, her face pale and drawn in the dim light. She had just shared something that shook him to his core. Her mother had been hiding something, something that was now bringing all this danger down on them. Jake's mind raced, processing everything he'd learned so far. This was no longer just about the papers, or even about him helping this girl to escape. Whatever her mother had been hiding was a bigger mystery, and it was a mystery that would change everything if they uncovered it. The girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty and fear. "Do you think they'll come after me?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. Jake took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. They couldn't stay hidden for long. "They're already after you," Jake replied quietly, his voice serious. "But we'll keep moving. We'll find a way out." He didn't know how, but he had to believe that there was a way. He had to protect her. The girl looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting in her lap as she thought. I think my mom left me a clue," she whispered. Jake raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. "A clue? What do you mean?" The girl looked up at him, her eyes bright with something Jake hadn't seen in a while. "Hope. I remember now. My mom always had a secret stash. She'd hide things from people, things that she said were important. But she told me never to look, that it was dangerous. I think there's something in her old cabin." Jake's heart skipped a beat. The girl's mother had left her a clue? This could be the breakthrough they needed. They could get to the bottom of all of this, finally figure out what was going on. "We'll go there," Jake said quickly, standing up and pacing across the room. "We'll find out what's in that cabin." The girl nodded, though Jake could see the uncertainty in her eyes. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice small. "What if it's too dangerous?" Jake paused and looked at her. Her fear was real, and he couldn't ignore that. But they couldn't afford to wait. They couldn't stay hidden forever. "We don't have a choice," he said, his voice steady, though inside, he was anything but calm. "We need answers, and we need them fast." He knelt in front of her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "I'll protect you. We'll get through this, I promise." The girl nodded slowly, her lips trembling as she fought back the tears that were threatening to fall. Jake could see how much this was weighing on her, and it broke his heart. She had been through too much already. The sound of footsteps outside the cabin snapped Jake back to the present. His hand instinctively went to his gun. The men were closer than before. They were moving through the woods, their voices growing louder as they searched for any trace of the girl and Jake. Jake's pulse quickened. They didn't have much time. "We need to move," he whispered urgently, helping the girl to her feet. They moved quickly through the cabin, out the back door, and into the woods once again. The night air was cold, the wind rustling the leaves, but Jake's focus was on the task ahead. They had to get to the old cabin and see what it was that her mother had hidden. As they made their way through the forest, Jake's mind raced. What could be hidden in that cabin? And why had her mother gone to such lengths to keep it secret? The answers were just out of reach, but Jake knew one thing. He wasn't about to let the girl face this alone. They had to find the truth. The journey through the forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees thick around them, their footsteps muffled by the underbrush. But soon, the familiar sight of the old cabin came into view. It looked exactly like Jake remembered, run down, abandoned, and seemingly forgotten by time. But he knew that wasn't the case. This cabin held the key to everything. They approached cautiously, making sure no one was watching. The silence was deafening, and the only sound was the rustle of leaves in the wind. Jake motioned for the girl to stay back as he approached the door. His hand hovered over the handle, his senses alert to any sound. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. They were close, so close to the answers they needed. Slowly, he pushed the door open, and they slipped inside. The inside of the cabin was exactly how Jake remembered it, dusty and abandoned, with the faint smell of mildew hanging in the air. But as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw something he hadn't expected. There, in the corner, hidden beneath a pile of old blankets, was a small chest. Jake's breath caught in his throat. This was it. The girl's mother had hidden something here. Something important. He walked over to the chest, his hands trembling slightly as he knelt beside it. He opened the lid, revealing a collection of old papers, photographs, and a small, locked box. The girl stepped forward, her eyes wide. "That's it," she whispered. "That's what my mom was hiding." Jake carefully lifted the box out of the chest, his fingers brushing against the cool metal. The box was old, worn, and locked, but it was clear that it held something valuable. Something her mother had gone to great lengths to keep hidden. As Jake stood up, the sound of footsteps outside the cabin caught his attention. The men were getting closer. They didn't have much time. "We need to go," Jake said urgently. "We'll open it later. Let's get out of here." The girl nodded, and they quickly gathered the chest and the box. They had answers now, but they needed to survive long enough to find out the truth. Jake and the girl made their way through the woods, their breath coming in quick, shallow gasps as they clutched the chest and the locked box. The night was thick with silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves beneath their feet. Every step felt like it could be their last. The men who had been chasing them were still out there, their search growing more frantic as time passed. But Jake had to focus. He had the answers in his hands now, and he had to get them out of danger. They had to keep moving. The trees around them were dense, the moonlight barely cutting through the thick canopy above. It was disorienting. The shadows seemed to move with them as they walked, and every rustle felt like someone was close behind. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced over at the girl. She was keeping up, but her face was pale with fear, and her eyes flickered with uncertainty. "We're almost there," Jake said, his voice low but firm, trying to reassure her even though he wasn't sure of their safety himself. The girl nodded, but her eyes betrayed her fear. "What's in the box?" she asked softly. Jake hesitated. He had no idea what was inside the box, but he could feel the weight of it, the mystery pressing down on them both. "I don't know yet," he said, "but it's something your mom wanted you to have. We'll figure it out when we're safe." The girl didn't respond, but Jake could feel the tension in her small hand gripping his. They kept walking, the path ahead of them narrowing as they approached a small clearing. In the distance, Jake could see the faint glow of a campfire. His instincts kicked in. "Stay low," he whispered to the girl, pulling her toward the underbrush. They crouched down, hiding behind the thick foliage as they watched a group of men gathered around the fire. The men were talking in hushed tones, but Jake could hear their voices clearly. "They can't have gotten far," one of them said. "We need to find them before they disappear again." Jake's stomach churned. They were getting closer, and if they didn't act soon, they'd be cornered. The girl was trembling beside him, her breath quick and shallow. Jake knew they couldn't stay there much longer. "We need to move," he said, his voice tight. He led the girl in the opposite direction, moving quietly but quickly through the underbrush. The firelight dimmed as they moved farther away from the men, but Jake's senses remained sharp. They had to keep going, keep running. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small, rocky outcrop at the edge of a cliff. Jake paused for a moment, glancing back to make sure they hadn't been followed. The woods around them were eerily quiet now. It felt like they were alone, but he knew better than to trust the silence. "What now?" the girl asked, her voice barely audible. Jake's eyes scanned the area. The cliffside led down into a narrow ravine, and beyond that, he could see the distant glow of a town in the valley below. It was far, but it was their best chance at escape. "We head down into the ravine," he said. "We can make it to the town, and we'll figure out what to do from there." The girl nodded, her eyes filled with both fear and determination. "Okay," she whispered. Together, they carefully made their way down the rocky slope, the loose stones beneath their feet threatening to send them tumbling. But Jake kept his grip tight on the girl's hand, guiding her carefully. The air grew colder as they descended, and the sounds of the woods faded, replaced by the distant hum of the town below. Jake didn't stop to look back. Every moment they spent in the woods was one step closer to being caught, and he wasn't about to risk that. Finally, they reached the bottom of the ravine. Jake took a deep breath, scanning the area. The town was still far off, but the path ahead seemed clear. They could make it. "We're almost there," he said, his voice firm despite the exhaustion in his bones. The girl's hand tightened in his, and she gave a small, shaky nod. They started walking again, the sound of their footsteps the only thing breaking the silence. As they moved, Jake's mind raced. What was in the box? What was so important that it had led them all this way? The answers were just out of reach, but he knew one thing. He had to protect the girl. Whatever happened, they had to survive this. The path to the town was long and winding, but Jake pushed forward, determined to get them both there. They didn't stop, didn't slow down. The town was their only hope, and he would do anything to get them there safely. But as they reached the edge of the ravine, Jake's instinct screamed. They weren't alone anymore. A voice shouted in the distance. "They're down there. We've got them." Jake's heart dropped. The men had found them again. They were closing in. And this time, they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as the voices grew louder, closing in on them. They couldn't be far now. He glanced over at the girl, her small face tense with fear, her hand gripping his tightly. He could feel her trembling, but they couldn't stop. They couldn't afford to. The men had found them again. This time, there was no way out. Jake's mind raced, trying to think of a way to get them both out of this alive. But the path ahead was blocked by thick trees, and there was nowhere to hide. The sounds of the pursuit were now too close, and Jake knew that if they didn't act fast, they would be caught. "We need to move. Now," Jake muttered, pulling the girl along. But as they took a step forward, the sound of a vehicle's engine came into earshot. The truck. It was closing in. They had no choice. "Come on," Jake urged, dragging the girl toward a dense patch of trees. He could hear the crunch of the tires on the gravel road just behind them. They had seconds before they'd be visible. His mind was frantic, but there was only one thing he could do now: get them into the trees, away from the open road. They pushed through the dense underbrush, barely making a sound. Jake led the girl further into the forest, ducking low beneath the branches as he heard the truck pull to a stop nearby. The men were getting out, their footsteps heavy on the ground. "They can't be far," one of the men shouted. Jake's heart nearly stopped when he realized how close they were. They had seconds, maybe less. "Stay here," Jake whispered to the girl, his voice tight. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't say anything. She understood. Jake crouched low, waiting for the men to pass. His fingers wrapped around the gun in his waistband. He was ready to defend them both, but he knew there was no point in drawing attention to themselves. They had to keep quiet. The men were moving closer now, just on the other side of the trees. Jake's hand shook slightly as he watched them through the gaps in the branches. The voices grew louder. They were searching for any sign of movement. Jake felt the weight of the situation press on him like never before. He couldn't let them take the girl. He couldn't let them find what they were after. He glanced down at the girl, whose eyes were wide with fear. Her small face was pale, her lips trembling. He wanted to tell her everything would be okay, but the truth was, he didn't know. He didn't know if they could make it out of this alive. The men were almost directly in front of them now. Jake's heart raced in his chest. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had one chance. He could feel the girl's hand shaking in his, and he knew that he had to make a move. He motioned for her to stay low, and they slowly began to move backward, deeper into the trees. The men were still searching. Jake could hear them getting frustrated. They were almost there. But then, the unthinkable happened. A loud crack echoed through the woods as one of the men stepped on a branch, breaking the silence. "There they are," another man yelled. The game was up. Jake's pulse shot through the roof. They were out of time. Without thinking, Jake grabbed the girl's hand and ran. His feet pounded the ground beneath him, the weight of the box and chest pressing against his side. He could hear the men yelling behind them, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. They were so close to the end. The trees around them seemed to blur as they sprinted through the forest, but Jake wasn't looking back. He only focused on the distant light ahead. The town. It was their only hope. The lights of the town flickered in the distance as they pushed forward, but Jake could hear the footsteps of their pursuers gaining on them. The men were fast, and they weren't giving up. The girl was barely keeping up, but Jake wasn't going to let her fall behind. They had to make it. They had to reach the town, or everything would be over. They were only a few hundred yards from the edge of the woods when Jake heard the sound of an engine. A car. A moment of hope surged through him. A car could get them out of here, if they could just make it. But as he looked ahead, he saw the headlights of a truck pulling into the path, blocking their escape. The truck was massive, and the men were already out of it, moving quickly toward them. "This is it," Jake muttered. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the box, his fingers trembling. "Take it," he said to the girl, pressing it into her hands. "No matter what, keep it safe." She nodded, her small hands clutching the box tightly. "Jake," she whispered, "what do we do now?" Jake swallowed hard, his heart heavy. He had no answers for her. He had no way out. But one thing was certain, they couldn't go back. "We fight," Jake said, his voice steady. "We fight, and we make sure they never get what they want." With one last glance at the girl, he turned toward the men who were closing in on them. He wasn't going to run anymore. He wasn't going to hide. They had come too far. And now, he was ready to face whatever came next. In this thrilling chapter of Hell Angel's stories, a relentless pursuit unfolds through the dark, dense woods as a man and a young girl try to escape their dangerous pursuers. With each twist and turn, the tension grows as they face life-threatening obstacles. From secret clues hidden in a mysterious box to their near capture by men determined to uncover the truth, Hell Angel's stories take readers on an exhilarating journey through fear, survival, and courage. The heart-pounding chase intensifies as the two escape through the forest, but danger continues to close in on them. As they discover more about the dark secrets hidden by the girl's mother, the stakes get higher. The unfolding story reveals unexpected alliances and choices that define the boundaries between right and wrong, all while pushing the boundaries of loyalty and survival. The stories within Hell Angel's stories capture the essence of sacrifice, loyalty, and the fight for freedom. With every step they take, Jake and the girl move closer to the truth, but the men chasing them are determined to stop them, setting the stage for an epic confrontation. As the tension builds, the story weaves together themes of strength, survival, and the unrelenting fight against overwhelming odds. The conclusion brings a powerful clash, filled with drama, action, and suspense, as the characters face their greatest challenge yet. These Hell Angel stories are a gripping testament to the strength of the human spirit and the will to survive at any cost.